Scrub Dog of Alaska by Walt Morey. 2. The sun rose majestically through its summer arc. A light shaft filtered through the thick tree branches and bathed the little glade. A squirrel came cautiously down a tree trunk and sat up, chattering nervously. A second followed. They chased each other around the trees several times, then cut across the glade, past the still form of a dog. A weasel rose out of the grass. His snake-like head and beady eyes followed the playing squirrels. He darted toward them. He was halfway across the glade when the dog's head rose from the ground. The weasel stopped, surprised, then in a wink he disappeared back into the grass. The dog lay immovable for some time, as though gathering strength. Finally he made an effort to rise. He got his front feet up and fell on his side. He lay a few minutes, panting. He tried again. On the third attempt he stood, wobbling on 3 legs, sick and terribly weak. His right hind leg hung useless. He tried to put it down, but the moment it touched the ground he whimpered in pain. Finally he hobbled off on 3 legs. He went straight away from Aurora. The dog struggled ahead for 100 yards. Then his strength gave out, and he lay down. It was here that Harvey Scott found him. Scotty, or Whitewater Scotty to his friends, lived on a boiling stretch of river 30 miles away. He came striding through the forest, his shock of brown hair blowing in the breeze. Scotty had been a prospector and trapper until he lost his left hand in an accident. A metal hook was now fastened to the stub. He'd given up trapping and had sold his dog team. It was too hard to skin out fur with only one hand. Now he prospected, working the small streams in the area. He admitted he did well. 2 or 3 times a year, Scotty visited Aurora and loaded up with supplies at the trading post. That was as close to a city as he wanted to get. When he became hungry for talk, he hiked up to see his good friends Fred and Celia Martin and their 14-year-old son David. They lived a mile or so out of Aurora. Fred Martin ran one of the longest trap lines in the area. Scotty was on his way to visit them when he came upon the dog. He squatted on his heels and studied the dog. He noted the rips in its hide, a particularly bad one in the throat, a broken leg. Because he'd had dogs most of his life, he could guess what had happened to this one. "Well, friend," he said gently, "you've been in quite a fight. I'd guess no one dog did this to you. Couldn't you run away, or did they corner you?" He stroked the dog with his big hand. The dog looked at him with amber eyes, but did not try to move. "This is no place for you, friend," Scotty continued. "You need help, or you're going to die. Let's see what I can do." Very carefully, Scotty worked his hand and hook up under the dog's body. Scrub whimpered. "It's all right, friend," he said, in a soothing voice. "It's all right, friend," said the soothing voice. "It's all right." With infinite care, he lifted the dog and held him against his chest. Then he continued toward the Martins' cabin. The Martins' neat 3-room log cabin squatted in the center of a small meadow. There were 2 outbuildings, one a food cache high on stilts, the other a place on the ground where Fred Martin stored his furs. 9 sled dogs were staked out around the cabin, each with his own house. They set up a great clamor at the sight of Scotty. The door to the main cabin was open. Scotty called, "Anybody home?" Without waiting for an answer, he walked into the kitchen. A small, neat woman with straight, jet-black hair wound in braids about her head turned from the stove. A boy of about 14, with the same fine-boned features and smooth olive skin as the woman, sat in a chair. A pair of homemade crutches lay on the floor beside him. Mother and son chorused, "Scotty! Scotty, come in!" The boy said, "Hey! A dog! Where'd you find him? What's wrong with him?" Scotty laid the dog carefully on the kitchen floor and said, "He got chewed up in a fight. He can't walk. I couldn't leave him to die. You got any hot water and rags, Celia?" Celia hurried to get them. The boy leaned forward and looked at the dog intently. "I know him. I saw him almost every night on the way home from school last winter. He always looked half-starved." "He's half-starved now," Scotty said. "You can count every rib." Celia returned with rags and a basin of hot water. Scotty began washing the dog. Scrub lay perfectly still, flinching only when the man touched a particularly bad spot. When Scotty cleaned the gaping tear in his throat, he whimpered. "He's pretty brave to take that pain," David said admiringly. "He knows I'm trying to help him." Scotty finished the washing and asked, "You got a sharp needle and thread, Celia? We'll have to sew up these worst rips. You can do the sewing." "I've never sewn anything but cloth or leather, Scotty." "I'll show you what to do." They worked on the dog for over an hour. He endured patiently, even when Celia sewed the bad tear in his throat. When she finished, she stroked his head and murmured, "It's all over now. You were very brave." Under Scotty's direction, David whittled splints for the broken leg. With Celia's help, the prospector pulled the bones together. She held the splints and helped bind them tight to the leg. Afterward, they moved Scrub onto an old blanket, and Scotty pulled him into a corner of the kitchen where he would be out of the way. The sun had dropped beneath the distant rim of trees. Dusk shadowed the kitchen. Celia lit the lamp. Scotty leaned back inside. "You did fine, Celia. That's the biggest sewing job I've ever done on a dog." "Where did you find him?" Celia asked. "In the woods, about a half-mile from Aurora." He studied the dog critically. "He's a young one, a last winter's pup. He's got the makings of a big, powerful dog. Look at the size of those leg bones and feet, the depth of his chest. Got some wolf in him, too, a quarter maybe, a little more. He'd be a pretty fair-looking dog if he was fed up and cared for. Wonder why anybody'd let him go to pot like this." He glanced at the boy. "You said you'd seen him, Davy. What's the story on him?" "He's a cull that Smiley Jackson threw out. He was always sneaking around houses trying to steal something to eat. Everybody hated him. They called him Scrub. I used to feed him what I had left in my lunch basket." "What you deliberately saved to feed him," Celia said. "He always looked so starved." "Scrub," Scotty shook his head. "Not much of a name to live up to." You said he could be a pretty good dog," Celia said. "Then why did Jackson cull him? What makes him a scrub, Scotty?" "I don't know. I wouldn't have culled him on the strength of what I see here. Maybe what's wrong with the dog is Smiley Jackson." "What do you mean?" "Jackson thinks he knows it all when it comes to dogs, but he's always selling dogs to other mushers who use them to beat him in races. Maybe he made a mistake in judging this one, too. When this dog was little, I'll bet he was so clumsy he fell all over himself. A big, clumsy pup never looks too bright. Maybe Jackson didn't take any of that into consideration." "We've got to notify him the dog is here," Celia said. "Why?" David demanded. "Because it's his dog." David looked at the dog lying on a blanket, unable to move, enduring pain without a murmur. A great sympathy welled up in him. "Jackson threw him out when he was a little fellow. He could have frozen to death, starved, or been killed by some big animal. I used to see him sneaking around, scrounging for enough to live, being chased by other dogs, people throwing things at him. He's had enough trouble." "I feel sorry for him too," Celia said, "but Jackson is mean enough to try to cause trouble for us if he found out he was here and we hadn't told him. If we send him back, Jackson will knock him in the head for sure," David warned. That would be Jackson for you," Scotty agreed. Celia frowned, biting a fingernail thoughtfully. "Scotty, would you like a dog? You live far enough away so Jackson would never see him." Scotty shook his head. "Had dogs for 25 years and loved every one of them. Doctored them when they got sick, patched them up when they got hurt, and buried them when they died. I don't need them now, and I don't want to go through that again." "A dog would be a companion. When I feel lonesome and want to talk, I hike up here and pester you folks," Scotty said. "I'm sorry. By the way, where is Fred?" "He left 3 days ago to almost rebuild one of the overnight cabins a grizzly wrecked. He figured it would take almost a week. I'm glad you came," Celia smiled. "Fred didn't cut enough wood. I'm about out. David can't handle the chain or the axe with that broken leg." "I'll take care of it first thing in the morning," Scotty said. "It's going to cost you a dinner and a lot of talk." "Dinner first," Celia said, "then talk. What would you like, Scotty?" David knew what was coming. His mother and Scotty went through this little ritual every time he came. Scotty scratched his chin thoughtfully. "You got any bacon?" "We've been saving a piece," Celia smiled. "We could have bacon pancakes," Scotty suggested. That all right with you and Davy?" Pancakes with diced pieces of bacon in the batter for flavor were Scotty's special treat. "It's fine," Celia said. "What are we going to do about the dog? About Scrub?" Nothing. Your father will decide when he comes home. Dad won't let us keep him." "Probably not. We don't need another dog, but he can make that decision." Scotty went to wash and bring in the slab of bacon. David watched his mother move about the kitchen and wondered if he would ever get around like that again. Now that he was on crutches, he seemed more conscious of her light, quick steps. His father had laughingly said she was as fast as a squirrel because she didn't weigh much more. For all her slightness, David knew she was surprisingly strong and capable. She had been educated at a mission school in Anchorage before marrying Fred Martin and moving out here. Except for Nick and Jean Moore, David's parents associated very little with the people of the settlement. His father was a trapper. He had little in common with the miners of Aurora. The dog moved a bit inside. David's thoughts returned to the dog. He was still thinking about him when Scotty came in with the slab of bacon. David asked, "Scotty, will the dog get well?" "Sure, those rips in his hide look worse than they are. But his leg's broken. It'll mend." Scotty began dicing bacon, holding the slab in place with his hook. "He'll be as good as ever." "How can you be sure?" Scotty glanced at him. "Broken bones heal, you know that. There's no reason this dog shouldn't." "The leg's going to be stiff and sore and weak," David said thoughtfully. "Every time he puts it down, the pain's going to be awful." He was aware his mother had turned her head and was listening. "It'll hurt," Scotty agreed. "It's a broken bone. But when the time comes to walk, he'll endure the pain. He instinctively knows he's got to try to use it, or the leg will never get strong enough to walk again." "How can he when it'll hurt so much? He's an animal and can't reason. He does what nature tells him to." Scotty gave Celia a double handful of diced bacon. She spread it in the frying pan, where it began to sizzle. Scotty turned then and looked at David. "Speaking of walking, how come you're still on crutches? I figured you'd be off them by now." "He should be." Celia didn't look up. "The leg is healed. The doctor took the crutches away the last time we were in and told David to start walking." "Why didn't you?" Scotty asked. "It's not strong enough," David insisted. "I can tell. I could fall and break it again. Then it might never heal, and it hurts. If you knew how much it hurt just to try to straighten it or touch it to the ground." "That's really the whole thing." Celia poured the diced bacon into the batter and began beating it. Her voice was half angry. "It hurts, so David won't even try. When we got back from the doctor's last time, he sat in that chair for almost a week and refused to move because he didn't have his crutches. We coaxed, threatened, tried to reason, but it did no good. Fred finally made him those crutches so he'd get outside for a little exercise and fresh air." They'd been over this many times, and David had only one answer. He gave it again. "When I know I can walk, I will." How will you know if you don't try?" Scotty asked. "That's exactly what we've been telling him." Celia poured batter into the pan. "You sound like you don't want to walk." "We're beginning to wonder, David." "Or you sound like I don't want to walk." "We're beginning to wonder, David." "Naturally it'll hurt when you first start walking," Scotty reasoned. "You haven't used those leg muscles for months. It's the muscles that'll hurt. They're weak and flabby and sort of kinked up now because you keep your knee bent. The longer you wait, the weaker the leg will become, and the more it'll hurt when you do try to use it." "The doctor made that clear to him," Celia said, "but it did no good. As a matter of fact, we've about come to the conclusion that David may be a permanent invalid, simply because he broke a leg and now hasn't the courage to try to walk on it when it's healed." Scotty looked at David soberly. "They're calling you a quitter, Davy." David didn't answer. Both his parents had tried to shame him into torturing himself, and it hadn't worked. Now Scotty was trying. He was determined that wasn't going to work either. He knew what he was doing. When he finally threw those crutches away and walked, maybe they'd all realize he'd known all along what he was about. "Pancakes are ready," Celia said. "Scotty, you and David get to the table." David was glad that put an end to further talk about him. The dog lay perfectly still all through dinner, but his amber eyes watched them. Afterward, David tried to tempt him with table scraps, but he pulled his head away. "He's too sick to eat right now," Scotty said, "but he might be thirsty. He could have a fever." Celia put a pan of water under the dog's nose. He lifted his head and lapped greedily. Then he lay back full length again. When the dishes were washed and put away, Scotty and Celia sat at the table with the lamp between them. Scotty folded his right hand over the steel hook and was ready to talk. David settled himself carefully on the floor near the dog and reached out to pat the big head. The dog pulled away, watching him warily. "All right," he murmured. He leaned against the wall to listen to the talk. Scotty was reveling in the conversation like a man satisfying a great thirst. They began by discussing last winter's fur harvest, the prospects for this year, the kind of winter it had been, and what the coming winter might be like. "Could be bad," Scotty observed. "We've had 2 mild winters in a row. It's about time for a hard one." "I hope not," Celia said. "That means more wood, food, and clothing." "Means better fur, too," Scotty said, "and better prices. And harder to get around the trap line. And a lot harder on the dogs." Mention of dogs brought them to dog sled racing. They talked about the fur rendezvous at Anchorage, and the North American and a dozen lesser races, and how the sport had grown and changed over the years. "When I was a kid," Celia said, 2 or 3 teams would get together and race just for fun. Now it's big business with huge cash prizes and people coming from thousands of miles away to take part and see it. That brought them to the people they knew, and the latest news from the outside, their term for the South 48 states. Celia finally said, "You know about the big oil strike, Scotty. The last time we were in Fairbanks, people were streaming in, heading north of the Arctic Circle to the strike. Fairbanks is getting to be a big modern city. Gold brought 'em north to begin with," Scotty said. "Then they found fur and salmon, now oil, biggest of all. We're going to get a lot of people up here, and that'll change the country, and I don't like it." The kitchen door had been left open for ventilation, and through it David watched the last gold fade out of the sky, and the distant trees rise black and solid against the night skyline. The dog slept for a time. David dozed off. When he awoke, Scotty was standing and saying apologetically, "If we don't turn in soon, it'll be morning before we know it." He offered the dog another drink, which was refused. "I can take him out to sleep in the shed with me," he said to Celia. "Let's not move him. He seems to be comfortable." Scotty said good night and went out to the little shed where they stored the furs in winter. A cot had been set up there for his visits. Celia went to her bedroom. David hobbled into his own room and left the door open so he could hear the dog. He undressed, got into bed, and lay listening to the sounds of the night coming through the open window. There was the occasional scrape and rattle of a dog's chain. Somewhere a fox yapped excitedly. Another answered a long way off. From the distant river came the unmistakable murmur of waterfowl. A couple of dogs barked sharply. Night breezes whispered through the big spruce at the back of the house. The tip of a limb scratched softly across the roof. David thought of the injured dog lying on the kitchen floor. Scrub wasn't much of a name to live up to, Scotty had said. He thought of the dog's many injuries and wondered how long it would be before the animal could walk. Would he walk again when he discovered how painful it was to try? He'd learned something about pain during the months he'd been on crutches. Yesterday, in a burst of determination, he'd set out to go to Aurora, just a mile away, to visit Nick and Jean Moore. He'd given out less than halfway there and had taken several slow, painful hours to hobble home on his crutches. He knew about pain and that terrible feeling of weakness. He felt discouraged, beat, sorry for himself, and now sorry for the dog, whose injury was so like his own. His leg began to throb and sleep would not come. Much later, he thought he heard the dog trying to move about. He was out there in a strange place, lonesome and alone, maybe dying. Nothing should die alone. He sat up, reached for his crutches, and went quietly into the kitchen. The moon shone through the open door and bathed the kitchen in soft light. The dog's head was up, his eyes watching David. His mouth was open, panting. David got a dish of water and put it by his head. The dog lapped it dry. He filled the pan again. The dog half emptied the second pan, then dropped his head and lay still. David looked down at the dog. Then he carefully lowered himself to the floor beside him and leaned against the wall. He felt a great flood of sympathy for the unwanted, uncared-for animal. Without thinking, he reached out and patted his head. The animal did not flinch or pull away. The fur between his sharp ears was silky, soft, and thick. David scratched experimentally at the base of the dog's ears. "Can't sleep, huh?" he whispered. "Me either. I'll bet your leg hurts. Mine does. It always seems to hurt more at night. Guess I won't be going as far as Aurora for some time. Neither will you." The amber eyes studied the boy as the ears listened to the whispered, intimate voice. "We've got the same problem, broken legs. You've got other injuries, but the leg's the important one." David was silent, patting the dog's head, thinking, "I guess you were in a mighty rough fight today, but you've got a lot worse one coming. Scotty says you're going to get well, and he should know. But wait till you try to walk. My folks and Scotty don't know what that's like. I do." This intimacy with a human was a new experience for Scrub. There was no threat from this boy whose hand now offered pleasant caresses. The voice was the same quiet, sympathetic one he had heard during the winter when, half-starved, he had been tossed sandwiches from the boy's lunchbox. Scrub's tail thumped the floor feebly. With his front paws, he clawed himself close and laid his big head on the boy's knee. David smiled down at him. "I guess you've never had a friend before," he murmured. "Well, you have one now." And that's the end of chapter 2.